Hello folks, welcome to Fluent UI React Trainings. The goal of this course is to explain core principles of Fluent UI React v9 and make your work with Fluent UI React components more efficient. In the first lesson, we will learn how to efficiently customize components, what are the basic APIs in Fluent UI React v9, and how to efficiently control state of components. But before, let me explain basics of the course itself. We prepared code demos on StackBlitz. You can either fork them, or you can download them and run them locally. Also, every example contains either additional summary or some tasks. So if you will be looking into examples after the session, you can quickly check what this example is about and what you can learn from it. And with the first example, let's learn how React gets translated to HTML and how it works in Fluent UI React v9. Let's start with a native button. We can notice that it has some props. For example, onClick, area described by, class name. We can inspect it. And in inspector, we can notice that indeed it has area described by, it has class name, it has some text, and if I will click on it, we can see that alert was called. So what about Fluent? We can notice in markup that there is also Fluent, it also renders button, but what makes it different or what doesn't? Of course, Fluent UI button supports some additional things, for example, icons and some other behaviors, but it also tries to follow behavior of HTML elements. And this statement is true for every Fluent UI React component. So if I will grab all these props and add them to this button, I can notice in markup that area described by is there, that class is there, and even onClick handler gets called. Summary of this section is that if you see Fluent UI React component and its name button, probably it follows the same semantics as HTML element. For example, if there is a link component, it will follow the same semantics as anchor. And all props that are passed to Fluent UI React components are also passed to HTML. For example, we can check that button in Fluent UI React supports all possible handlers that are available on plain HTML button, and the same thing is true for area props and for other props that you can pass to HTML element. That's awesome, but what about something more practical? In our docs, you can mention that button supports icon prop, and indeed, if I will pass some letter or a string to button component, we can notice that it gets rendered in HTML markup. What we can also notice is that we have fui button, which represents button component itself, and fui button underscore underscore icon. And this underscore underscore class name after component name is probably the simplest way how you can identify slots in markup. Now let's learn why it's powerful. Slots is a powerful concept because you can not only pass something to a slot, you can also customize it as any React component. And let's learn how to do that. The first step that we will do, we will convert icon slot from using shorthand prop, how we used with X letter, to longhand form. And now we can see that we are passing an object to an icon slot. But result in HTML markup is the same, because we passed just a set of React props to a component. We can also pass area hidden prop, because this slot renders a span element and we can pass an area attribute to it, and it was visible in markup. The same is true for class name. We can pass class name foo and it will be there, which is awesome. That allows to customize Fluent UI React components very deeply. We also, like to a regular button, we can add onClick handler and do some alert. And if I will click on button, nothing happens. But if I will click on X, we can see that alert was called. Slots are a very powerful concept, and you will notice them not only in button components, but in many other components. And the nicest thing that this concept that I just shown you works with every slot in every Fluent UI React component. You can learn it once and use it everywhere. In the beginning of the lesson, I mentioned that we will learn how to control state of components efficiently, and it's where we are starting to do that. First of all, we need to understand the concept of controlled and uncontrolled components in React. You can learn a bit more about these concepts from React docs itself. For example, there are docs for input component, and this is covered there. I will try to focus more on differences and how things are working. But if you want to know more about how things are working deeper, probably you would like to jump into React docs. So let's start with the first example. We have uncontrolled component. This is just input, we can check it in markup, it doesn't have any props, and I can freely type there. This example is not really useful until you're using form validation library that supports working with uncontrolled components, because you cannot grab value from it. You cannot do anything with that. But there is a special case for uncontrolled component, and it's called with a default value. You can predefine what will be in this field once a page gets loaded. And to do that, you are using prop called default value. In this case, I have hello world there, and still I can freely type there, and behavior is the same to the previous example. But small heads up there, the prop that we use there is called default value. So now let's talk about case with controlled component. And here we can see the first difference. Now we are using value prop, not default value. Again, heads up there. We have also hello world there, but if I will type something there, it doesn't really work. And it's a moment where we should actually start to control the state of the component. Let's check what do we have there. We are starting with useStateHook that holds state value for our input. It has predefined value called hello world. We can see this in input. And now we can also notice that value that is displayed in input also coming from our state hook. And to get updates from input, we are using onChange event handler. And now if I'm typing something, indeed we have changes. You can also use value from the state for some other things. For example, in this case, I'm using value just to be logged and displayed on a page. But this example is not so simple, because here I'm implementing probably the simplest feature with controlled components, but feature that makes sense. I have clear input button, and what this button does, it says value to be empty. And once I will click on it, input gets cleared, and we can notice that our state also is empty. So again, that's awesome. It's how primitives are working in React, how this gets translated to Fluent UI V9 components. Once you will look on this example, you can notice that probably there is nothing different. All cases are the same, but there is one difference. Input now comes from Fluent UI React V9 components. So, for example, if I will use uncontrolled case and I will just input something there, it works. The same true for uncontrolled component with a default value. Again, we have hello world there, I'm trying to input something and it works. For controlled example, where the value is hard-coded and updates are not handled, I cannot enter anything. And for a case where we are controlling state, I can do the same thing. The outcome there, or summary, is that input component, and not only, follows the same pattern with controlled and uncontrolled as it's defined in React. For example, the same thing happens with popover, dialog, and some other components. They are not input, you will not use string values there, but you control their open prop. Because these components, again, can be uncontrolled, where you are not controlling state, and controlled, when you actually controlling state, and you can declare that this popover has open false, and it will be never opened. But there is one key thing that we should learn also there. If there are state updates, and this is different compared to native elements. And the state updates are declared from onChange on openChange. These callbacks will have a second argument, and this argument will be databag. For example, in case of input, it has type on input change, and this databag contains data value. And we can clear this input, and once I will try to enter some character, we can notice that event is still there. Event has type change, it has target input, we are getting this information from there, but we're also logging data, and data is coming from a second param, and data is an object. This object contains value. This probably is not so useful for input, but when you will deal with other components like popover, dialog, etc., this will be more useful. In this example, story about uncontrolled and control components continues. Let's start with reviewing markup. Here we have popover, popover trigger, and popover surface. And if I will try to click on this button, we can see that all things are rendered. So what is popover? Popover is a state controller component. It's a utility component that handles some accessibility behaviors, it controls state, it controls event handlers, and in next example we will of course see how it works. The next component is popover trigger, and it's actually why this pattern is called trigger pattern. Trigger is a utility component, and it wraps some other component that will be rendered in markup and adds some additional behaviors like on-click handlers, on-key down handlers that allow properly work as a trigger for popover in this case. That's why when I'm clicking on this button, a popover gets actually opened. And we can also get there to popover surface, and popover surface actually represents this element that contains actual content that will be in a popover. As I mentioned, some other components in Fluent UI React also using this pattern. For example, menu, dialog, tooltip, and some other components too. They will also have component called trigger. For example, in case of dialog, it will be dialog trigger. What is important there for us that, again, this pattern works consistently. And this pattern allows us also to control state. In this example, if I will click on a button, open popover, I can mention that it gets opened. Nothing changed. So where is something special? For example, let's start there and expect what happens on popover. We can notice that again we are controlling state using state hook, and we also have open prop path there from state, like in previous example with input. We also have on open change, and on open change callback uses databag from popover. So once I will click on a button, a popover will call on open change callback. This callback contains databag, this databag contains .openProp, and this prop contains suggested value for a state. And in this case, it will be open. If I will click outside, the same life cycle will happen, but in this case, the suggested state update will be false. And you can see it gets closed. So why this pattern is useful? For example, we can have cross button inside a popover, and this button should close it. If I will click inside popover, nothing happens. If I will not have this on click, also nothing will happen. But if I will add a state update handler, for example, in on click, I will have set open false. Once I will click on this button, it gets closed. This is just a small and naive example, but it shows how powerful controlled pattern is. It allows you to control state of components outside of it. Okay, so now let's jump to the last example in our session, and it's where I'm going to explain caveats with custom triggers, or using custom components as triggers. This is probably the better explanation. So let's grab our existing popover example, put it to code. And let's try to do the simplest thing. Let's replace Fluent button just with a plain HTML button. And it works. Awesome, but how it's useful? It's not a custom component, and you will be totally correct. Now I will have custom button that has some props, that has button rendered, and it shows children. And now we have all things in place. And now once I will try to replace our existing plain HTML button with popover, and I will reload page just to be sure. Once I'm clicking on a button, nothing happens. And this is a problem, of course. So as I said, custom components require some tweaks. And the first tweak is that we should spread props. Because from popover trigger, we are getting some event handlers. For example, on click, on key down, and as we don't spread on click, of course, nothing is happening. Now I'm clicking, but popover is nowhere. But in reality, it was on the top of the page. Why it's happening? Because, well, not only prop spreading is required, but we also need to pass ref. And for that, we need to refactor our custom button to do ref forwarding. And for that, we will use forward ref API from React. And after our small refactor, and once we will pass ref to a component, we can see that there are some TypeScript errors. We will fix them in a second. But now, all things are working, which is awesome. So now let's fix typings. And the first thing that comes to forward ref is an argument, and this argument is type of an element where we will forward ref. And the second are props. So now we can just do children string for simplification. And now TypeScript is happy. Our popover is in place, and now even if I will load this page, everything is still in place. Awesome. Can I replace a button with Fluent button? Yeah, I can. And I can also predefine some appearance like primary. And all things are working. Awesome. And what is outcome from there? That if you have custom components that are not Fluent components, you need to ensure that pass trigger forwards ref, like there, uses forward ref API, and that this component also spreads props. Otherwise, you will not be able to make your popover working, or menu or dialog, whatever. So that was this section. Now let's jump to the last one. And I need to reload this page, it seems like. Container is booting, and now let's talk about the last thing. This is something different compared to Fluent UI React v0 to Fluent UI React v8, and it's what is called JSX collections. So, as you recall, before, to define a set of menu items, we were using prop code items where you're passing an array of JSX objects. With v9 it's different. We rely on JSX because obviously it's more flexible, and surprisingly it's also more performant. So here we are. Here is our example. We can also notice that menu, as was said before, follows the same pattern we have. The same trigger pattern. We have menu itself, menu trigger, we have menu popover, we have menu list, all things are there. Now if I will click on this menu, it gets opened. Awesome. The difference compared to previous versions, to predecessors, is that these items are defined as JSX elements. And it provides a lot of flexibility. For example, if you would like to have a menu item open that has predefined text, you can freely compose it. You can get it there, replace it, and it still works. If you would like to have some items in group, so have menu item group, and have some additional state things, state interactions, some custom behaviors there, you can also compose it. That wasn't possible before, but now with v9, this flexibility is in place. and once I will put proper JSX component back, all things are working. But let's restore example to the original state. And you may say that before, items prop was very useful because you can just structure data, pass it there, and everything will work. I will say that there is nothing different now. If you have data coming from backend and you would like to render it, you can do it like with any other React component. Here are our items. Now we can map them. Our item will be menu item. Menu item. We will pass item as a content. And of course, once we iterating on an array, we should not forget that we should be using keys. And now all things are in place and everything works. And if I will add a new element to a collection, for example, open will be back. Here we are. All things are working. To summarize, this approach with JSX collections is simply more flexible. It provides you more flexibility, it allows you to compose components as you would like, not how API dictates you. If you're interested what is behind JSX collections, what is behind slots, and what is behind triggers, I suggest to check this video, where with my teammates we are providing answers on these questions. Thanks for being with me, and see you next time.